Welcome back to Directly Current, the EV Politics podcast hosted by me, Max Patton. This week, our guest is someone with substantial public and private sector experience with EVs and the energy transition at large in America. Rohan Patel worked in the White House as a climate advisor under Obama, and in 2017, he started work as an exec in charge of public policy and business development at Tesla, where he worked for 7 years, some might say the golden years of Tesla, before leaving at the same time as another prominent executive, Drew Baglino, earlier this year. Rohan, unlike lots of other ex-Tesla talent, has stayed out of the auto industry for now, but he's still absolutely dedicated to clean energy and transport, and he gives a lot of smart opinions and insights on Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it. So I thought he'd be an amazing guest for our program. Having worked closely alongside Elon Musk and other top minds, like of course Drew at Tesla, in addition to his White House role, I can't really think of many people better positioned than Rohan to give us some insight into what the near future might look like for EVs in a new Trump administration with a narrowly controlled Republican Congress, because their policy objectives are probably going to be a lot different from what Biden had in mind with the Inflation Reduction Act. That said, and as you'll see in our conversation with Rohan, there's a lot to undo, and there's lots of industrial policy that maybe both parties might have in common. So without further ado, let's welcome onto Directly Current, Rohan Patel. I want to get started. For those of you listeners who aren't following you on X or aren't listening to your opinions and aren't as familiar, can you explain how you pivoted from working in the White House to working for Tesla way back in 2017?
Monday after, I had, I think, 10, 12, 14 interviews, something like that, with various folks, including Elon, and decided to join, made sure that I talked to the ethics folks and stopped dealing with anything that might even tangentially be related to Tesla, and then started up at Tesla right away. Mostly was focused on policy related stuff, not just in DC, but more broadly in North America. And then that shifted to site selection and supplier responsibility and business development work and global responsibilities.
Yeah, I think in 2017, a lot of the public probably then knew Tesla best for the products, the vehicles. But when it came to the energy business, which is obviously very huge now, thanks, I'm sure, in no small part to work you and your team did or other components of the business, maybe that was less well known, or at least that's my impression. What was the state of the non-vehicle side of the business, clean energy, all that back then?
What's funny, Elon predicted this from some time, that there would be wild, massive growth in the energy sector, especially on stationary storage and especially on the wholesale side, not just on the residential. So in the utility scale markets. And I think he's been proven dead right on this point. At that time, I came to Tesla in the middle of the Solar City acquisition. So part of my responsibility was actually integrating some of that team into my team. And man, there was some fantastic Solar City talent that came over. That was a big part of it. Solar City also had really good thought process around how best to sell. They had gone through lots of different iterations in terms of residential sales, had a good sense of how the solar plus storage market would work. The Solar City acquisition, much maligned generally, but the talent incoming was huge. Lots of really important and impressive talent that came in.
Yeah, and I think folks might today realize that if you use the Tesla app to manage their solar panels, it ties into your Model Y or your Model 3 as a big energy reservoir. You can time charging, all of that. This is now, in some ways, table stakes in the industry, but I still think Tesla's integration and the way they do it is probably the best and industry leading. So can you just explain more of that pitch to people who maybe aren't familiar, don't drive Tesla vehicles, don't use that, what the whole benefit of that energy ecosystem for someone's house is?
This storyline was, I think, incredibly important for Tesla as a part of its overall mission, but also as a way to sell the products, sell the vehicle products even, as a part of an entire ecosystem that was meaningful and that could, whether you're a libertarian who wanted to be off grid, either literally or intuitively off grid, let's say, or off grid, or you were just a tree hugger, you could see it both ways. The thing that you're referring to, though, in terms of the app integration, how you charge, what time you charge, how your solar panels and storage are connected to your vehicle, the of which you can see how much solar you're producing, when your battery's kicked on, when you're charging, and managing against that, and then developing integration with the local utility, moving towards virtual power plants in certain places. All of those things require a lot of coordination. And one of the advantages I think that Tesla developed, and it was quite intentional, was that seamless integration between, not always so seamless, but generally quite seamless integration and vertical integration across those various different layers. There's not a lot of calling up third parties to try to get some app-based thing or try to understand the inverter thing, or let's figure out no, it's literally all part of the Tesla ecosystem.
Right. And nowadays they're doing, for whatever people think of Cybertruck as a product, that has a built-in AC inverter. And I know that's potentially a huge deal for that vehicle to grid bidirectional charging. These are becoming now much bigger buzzwords in the industry.
Just to remember,
Yeah.
the original Roadster actually had that as well. So
Okay.
this is not a matter of technical capability to do this. I've long wondered, I think the Cyber is a brilliant choice to do it in the Cybertruck, but long wondered, the technical capability is actually quite trivial. I'm saying trivial like I'm some great electrical engineer. It's not that trivial. What's much harder in the V to G realm is the interconnection costs, the labor costs associated, and the relative upside compared to those soft costs and permitting costs and interconnection costs. So that's where it's like, how many people are going to be using this?
Yeah.
Is it really worth it? Should we put this even on the vehicle? Every vehicle?
Yeah.
Those questions are harder.
Yes, that's basically how much of a gamble are you willing to do? I know we've seen, I think Ford and GM have a slightly different approach to doing that with their large battery electric trucks. And maybe the industry will coalesce around a standard. I haven't followed that too closely. I know there's a lot of work there, but that's my next question is a lot of the work you did with business development, with a lot of this work on policy as well at Tesla involved reaching to people outside the company, working with other companies. And that's something that in the public, at least, whatever you think of Elon, people tend to have this perception that Tesla is like Apple, vertically integrated, doesn't work with anyone. But when you think about building superchargers, connecting with utilities, that requires a lot of cooperation. So how did that all kind of work, getting Tesla involved with everybody else, with the power utility companies, with local companies, with suppliers, I'm sure, who you needed to use?
Hard effing work. Yes. We have a balkanized energy system. In the United States, it's even harder than most places, which means when you're at Tesla, you're dealing with the utility on 30 different projects that are somewhat related and unrelated. You've got, you're pulling wire in one place, you're doing panel upgrades in another place, you're trying to figure out transformer availability. Why does this interconnection timeline take so damn long? What's the study that's needed? There's so many things happening just within one company, that we're interacting with one utility. In California, was, of course, even more, it was exacerbated because you have all of the things happening in one place. That's not always the case. There's so much storage being deployed, so much solar being deployed, lots of supercharging necessary, and vehicle sales were through the roof.
Yeah.
So it was a little bit less of a pressure point in other places, but it was a clear signal of what's to come. So yeah, investment in people that understand, not necessarily from the utility, although we got a bunch of people, some of the best people we had actually came and had some utility background or utility commission background. I've said for some time now, we need to make working at utility commissions sexy. It is insanely important work for the future of the energy transition. Those utility commissions and utilities in the United States have a big role to play. And we don't necessarily have the capacity and the talent level that we need at those places.
For folks who think that you worked for Obama, you're some kind of lefty, obviously you believe in climate change, you believe in the green transition. But I think one of the things that is really important to understand is you're also very reasonable and pragmatic about how this has to happen in the economy and what that involves. And that's a lot of work. And I think obviously your team did a lot of great work. Tesla's a bit of a different company now. You left the company. I know the company had a round of layoffs at the supercharger team. I think for many reasons, I would say they're still really well positioned. I'm sure you'd agree. But Do you think anyone else in the industry is thinking on that scale, or do you think Tesla is positioned to continue those gains? What do you think is going to happen for not just the cars, but this energy transition for companies that are like seized, I should say, poised to take advantage of it?
There's plenty of players. There's some interesting companies that I've had a chance to talk to and explore and see what they're up to on the charging side.
Yep.
It's a hard business. And I think the incentive structures were aligned somewhat perfectly at Tesla because it was so important. It was basically vitally important to have some level of cross-country travel available. And so keeping those stalls working and running well and having that experience be top notch was insanely important.
Yeah, in
Those
2017, you
same,
didn't have Electrify America or anyone else at that scale. The Supercharger network really was it for cross-country travel.
yeah, exactly. Even once you got those other players in the mix, the experience just wasn't that good. So when you talk to a Tesla owner, they were having not necessarily a perfect experience, but really damn good on the Supercharger network. And you talk to virtually anyone else, no matter what car they bought, no matter how good the car, like really well designed, excellent vehicles from other OEMs. And they just hated the thought process of having to figure out the public charging.
Yep.
It was really painful, even for the smartest people in the industry,
Mm.
even for people that worked at those companies.
Yeah.
Like it was great. Just talking to a guy at GM the other day, and he's got this. Yes, there's adapter hell, but thank God you guys made the decision to open up the Supercharger network. Honestly, it was painful to have to drive like he, at the time he had a Bolt, but now he's got a Lyric, to drive this car and not have the Tesla Supercharger network available.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
And you were still there, right, when that decision was made. I know obviously you weren't
yeah,
the only decision maker involved, and maybe you can't speak to every part of this, but what was that like, that moment in the industry? I think when it was Ford who first announced they were going to have adapters for the Tesla Superchargers and eventually switch to that new Tesla NACS format, which is substantially the same as the format we have, just a different shape, much more elegant connector. That's a big moment for the industry, obviously. What was it like on the inside at that time?
it was wild. If you think about what are the mission oriented decisions that really matter, and there's some good commercial reasons too, but look, I don't think I'm speaking out of school here. I don't think there were too many people on the Tesla finance team or sales team that had any interest in opening up the Supercharger
It
network
was your
whatsoever.
biggest competitive advantage. It's
It was a
huge.
huge competitive
Yeah.
advantage. I believed, and there were a few others, not just myself, that over time we were going to get needled to death by regulators, utility commissioners, others who were going to figure out and try to find ways to make it harder for us to operate as is. That's one. Not something that's not overcomable. We can fight, and that's possible. Then you've got the government coming in with huge pots of cash. Now, cash, it was like a blip on the radar, marginal, but still something. And was there a possibility to utilize that?
Hmm.
Even before that, though, even before the cash was out there, Drew and his team, Drew Baglino and his team, were really quite bullish about opening up the ability for others to adopt NACS, adopt the Tesla system,
Yep.
the Tesla hardware and configuration.
And Drew, for folks who
And
don't know, worked a lot on the powertrain and the vehicle end of things.
that's right. And managed charging
Yep.
and a whole bunch of other
Yep.
things, lithium refinery, lots of stuff. His, and I thought he was a very mission oriented leader. So they themselves thought, hey, let's try to open this up. Let's see where this is going. We had a lot of commercial conversations prior to that about different types of thought processes from OEMs of how they might adopt, whether there could be some kind of subscription model or they could pay into it, or there's lots of different avenues. Even though we got somewhat far with some of those conversations, in the end, we just couldn't get to an agreement that made any sense for either of us.
Hmm.
And I can't, I won't go into the specific names or entities, but we tried. Then just opening it up and saying, hey, here's NACS. Does anybody want it? That also didn't really work, frankly, because even that was like, and I thought we'd at least get some takers. Ford was most interested in figuring out a way, finding a way however possible. I think that also gave you an indication of like how committed they were to their EV program. And yeah, that took some time and lots of different technical and other types of conversations. But ultimately, Elon and Jim Farley had to hash it out and figure out what kind of deal could be made.
Yeah. And that was obviously a momentous moment in the industry. At this time, I think it's the Hyundai Ioniq 5 that's built in the US. The first one with that NACS plug is shipping. Rivian, when they release their vehicles, supposedly will, but I'm sure there'll be a lot of other legacy models that will release with that in the meantime. So for you now, being outside of Tesla, what is it like seeing the rest of the industry? You hinted at this earlier. The vehicles, the products themselves are really well designed, incredibly elegant. Obviously, they don't have all of the software and charging advantages that Tesla had, but what is it like for you to see, in many ways, Ford, Hyundai, these players actually take EVs super seriously now?
That's awesome. It's so cool. When you go to Europe, it's even more the case, partly because you see up until this anti-subsidy investigation, a lot of Chinese players.
Mhm.
In China, you also see a wild change.
Yeah.
It's Asia as well. So yeah, the thing that's really cool is just knowing just how, and this is like a great testament to the early Tesla folks and people all across the spectrum that were there, still there, left, however, in whatever capacity, and a lot of Tesla diaspora
Mhm.
at places like Ford and GM and Hyundai and elsewhere
Yeah.
that are helping to develop and work on these things. And also some new upstarts with no Tesla interaction whatsoever that are doing some really cool things. Yeah, I think it's great. What I would say is that if you look back at the Model S introduction in 2012, I'm hopeful, and the Chinese are doing some amazing stuff. It's not a monolith. Some companies are amazing, some are not that great.
Yeah.
But I hope that we see real scale take place. Seems like we're headed to that. But up until now, we really have not seen that outside of the Chinese in terms of scale.
Yeah, the US is on a completely different curve from where the Chinese are, and that's for a variety of policy and market reasons. And like you said, it's kind of chaos, and where it's chaos in the Chinese auto industry. Some players doing really well, other players folding. You have all this talent going in all these directions. And at the moment, our government on both parties has made a decision that we're just going to wall off. We're going to do these hardcore aggressive tariffs. And now you have the new Trump administration coming back in. And there's talk that the clean vehicle credit component, the $7,500 tax credit of the IRA, is going to go away. And that was a huge incentive to get people to buy electric vehicles. What do you think of that? How does that affect US, our market adopting EVs?
Yeah, it's a big headwind if that does in fact happen. There's a lot that has to happen before that. This whole tax reform, it's a big set of decisions, lots of negotiation that will take place
Yeah.
over lots of really impactful issues. This is just one of them.
Yeah.
Um, I think just to take a quick step back, though, no Democrat was able to put in place the kind of tariff regime, especially 301, those China tariffs,
Hmm.
but 232, 201, a lot of tariff changes, policy changes that Trump did.
Hmm.
And if you think about who supported those in the past before Trump, it was Bernie Sanders and the left wing of the Democratic Party, plus industrial labor unions. Generally speaking, isolationist, anti-free trade, pro-US manufacturing interests.
Yeah.
That's where Trump basically adopted that lock stock, called NAFTA the worst deal ever, basically came up with USMCA, which is NAFTA with a few changes, small, not even that big of changes. Then you fast forward, Biden basically keeps most of those tariffs, almost everything, makes some changes. I think pretty good enhancements, but some things that I didn't think made a lot of sense. But adds onto that a whole layer of industrial policy,
Hmm.
chips, batteries, battery materials, electric vehicles, solar storage, inverters, lots of other things, hydrogen, many other things. Now, ideologically, I don't think the Trump team is generally against industrial policy. It's not like this hardcore ideology that they have against it. In fact, they are You look at who he nominated to Secretary of State, you look at his previous folks, the Lighthisers of the world and others. These are, yes, they want robust trade policy, but they also want industrial policy. Now, what's different about the electric vehicle tax credits, to get to your actual question, is that in the past, the EV credit was basically just climate policy. It had a manufacturing cap. Tesla was out of it.
Yeah.
Right? During most of the Trump administration, Tesla did not have access to the credit. It had already hit the cap. GM also, about a year later, also did not have access to it. So it was de facto America last policy because the American manufacturers did not have access to the 7500, while literally President Xi could build a car himself with a Communist Party battery.
Yeah.
And get $7,500 from the US government. That was the de facto Trump policy. That continued into the Biden administration until the IRA changed that. So what the IRA did was it changed this 30D vehicle program, this vehicle credit, from what was previously a mostly climate and energy policy to a deeply industrial policy. Not perfect by any stretch, in my view, but it was an industrial policy, which is to say it had specific manufacturing requirements. It had domestic content requirements. It basically forced the supply chain and the manufacturing of these batteries and vehicles to come from U.S. and allied countries.
Yeah, with no cap.
With no cap. So it went from America last to America first. Now, Trump has been saying lots of stuff about the EV credit. It's Republican orthodoxy. So it's not really surprising that they would make an attempt to cut it, change it, whatever, get rid of it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm not, that's basic Republican orthodoxy at this point. That's also the same for the pollution regulations, EPA, CAFE, heavy duty side, California waiver, and almost any Republican. Trump is not really one way or the other. That's not really that big of a deal.
Mm-hmm.
What's a much more interesting question is how did they deal with, how did they rebrand, how did they develop a thought process for all of the industrial investments that are happening? And it's remarkable, the success story of the IRA. Remarkable. Wild numbers of investments, almost entirely due to the confluence of two policies, the Trump tariffs that Biden extended and the industrial policy of the IRA.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is happening in mostly Republican districts, in Georgia, in Tennessee. And these congressional districts are getting huge investments in big battery plants, big battery materials investments, lots of stuff that is really important to the future of the country, in my view. I think it's a national security imperative. We can argue that point. But this is the type of thing that should be right in the Trump playbook. It's definitely America first. It's definitely a manufacturing set of policies that's been helpful. It's definitely adding jobs. It's definitely a really important piece of the puzzle in terms of China competition.
Yep.
We don't really know, other than on the EV tax credit, which is just really one part of the larger narrative around this.
Yeah, it's one small element, like you said, especially on the supply side. Lots of other interesting things going on, particularly with those red states, right? Whose governors and whose own politicians can see the benefits for their citizens between the jobs and a lot of the opportunity to come from that. So that's where I want to get. We've avoided this until now, but I think we have to touch on this topic, right? You've got Elon Musk being heavily involved with Donald Trump and potentially his administration. And I know you respect him for lots of reasons. You worked with him, but with him in the fold now, do you think there's any influence that has on not just how this affects Tesla, but how this affects EVs and the transition overall? Because presumably, I talked about this with Mike and Jamie last week, right? Like the standards for EPA fuel emissions, that actually would benefit Tesla because they still sell a lot of those credits to other automakers. So there's little issues like that. So do you think that Elon, obviously still being very involved in Tesla and then maybe being involved in Trump orbit, has some influence on all this?
It seems like he's got a wild amount of influence, almost more than any non-governmental entity in our lifetimes. This is really an amazing, and he's chatting up the Iranians and the Ukrainians. God knows who
No
else he might
borders.
be
Yeah.
hanging with.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's, it's quite clear he's really in the mix. He's taking family photos with Trump.
Melania,
He's in the
some people are
mix.
calling it.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So I don't think there's any disputing his ability. Now, what's also clear to me is there's some things that are such a long shot. And would anyone, not just Elon, would anyone in his kind of place, even if they cared deeply about climate, electric vehicles, energy security, some other thing, would they try to reverse the momentum that exists within the Republican Party and Trump orbit on pollution standards? We saw what they did the last go around. Seems like they're going to go a little bit further or try to this go around.
Mhm.
Why would Elon try to throw himself on the track, so to speak? It doesn't seem likely. But I don't know. I don't know how he's going to react to any of this stuff. On parts of the solar storage, EV charging landscape, I think it really depends on how things shake out over the coming weeks and months, maybe. Maybe we don't have that long, but it'll depend on what's the art of the possible,
Yeah.
right? There's no point in spending a lot of time and effort when you don't really have a chance of success. If I was providing advice to anyone, but inclusive of Elon, I would wait to see how things shake out, see if there are some things where there's both an overlap where your priorities, whatever they might be, let's just say it's the 45X credit or some other credit, maybe even 30D. Maybe there's more of a chance than I'm giving it credit for.
Mhm.
Wait to see how things shake out and then see where you can really tip the scales, where there's a real chance, where maybe there's some MAGA Republicans that are excited about their investments.
Yeah.
Much talked about Marjorie Taylor Greene has a solar facility in her backyard.
Yeah.
That's not the only one. There's tons of those kinds of stories.
Yeah.
You could maybe partner with some folks on that.
Yeah. I know we're running short on time here. This is my last question, and this may be one without an answer, but how do you square the circle of folks? On one hand, you have Elon still heavily involved in Tesla, and Tesla's nominal mission statement is accelerating the world's transition to green energy, I think. And it seems like he cares about a lot of other things at the moment, and maybe that's not the first most priority for him personally. So where do people look to? Is it just basically, maybe I'm asking you, are you an optimist or are you a pessimist at this point? Is this where China potentially has the chance to really just overtake us in a lot of these industrial areas, continue to make really cheap solar panels, battery cells? Or do you think because of what Trump tariffs and partially Biden also did, that the momentum with the US battery industry and all that is so strong that it's just going to truck along regardless? What do you see? Obviously, this is a really hard question, but how optimistic or pessimistic are you about this proceeding as planned with a very different administration?
So I'm quite certain there will be a deceleration. And it's a long term, it's a no brainer. Either the US is leading this charge, developing, innovating, or the US is left behind. This will happen. And the United States innovation landscape is just remarkable. The startup landscape is just remarkable. The people involved are really amazing.
Mm-hmm.
So that will keep happening unabated. And I think that seems likely to continue. What's unlikely to continue in the short term is the massive amount of accelerant that has been taking place and that's been aided and abetted by the Biden administration and some of their industrial policy work. So it's a twofold. I'm quite pessimistic about the pace being as strong, but I'm quite optimistic long term that those innovations will overwhelm whatever lost pace we see and some of the deceleration we see from policy choices that I think are that are likely to be. Let's see. Maybe we'll see better outcomes than I'm predicting, but I think we'll likely see some outcomes that are going to be cheered in Beijing by those that set their policy goals a decade ago and are meeting and exceeding even their wildest expectations in terms of industrial development in many of these different sectors. In order for us to be in the game, we're going to need to invest. The dynamic, luckily, we do have the confluence of parties where both parties understand, generally speaking, are pro industrial policy, see the need for US investments, both here and with our allies. But unfortunately, short term, it seems Trump is dead set on slowing things down a little bit.
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting to watch play out. And we could have a whole Joe Rogan 2-hour special with you, I'm sure, about all of the potential policy branches this could go in. But thank you so much, Rohan, for your time. That's really a privilege.
You got it, man. No problem.
Wow, what a great conversation. And I mean that for Rohan more so than my own part. But hey, I'm the host. Rohan's one of those people whose brains and experiences make him someone you could just talk to for hours about deep, substantive policy in really rational ways. That's an increasingly rare quality in the media landscape, especially around polarized topics like EVs. I'm grateful for the opportunity, and I hope you are too as listeners. Subscribe to this podcast to get more guests in your feed like Rohan talking EVs and politics. We'll be back next Tuesday. You can check out all the research, writing, and public work the American EV Jobs Alliance is doing at evpolitics.org. Until next week, charge on.